Our last presenter is Dr. Kenneth J. Yin, and the research is Dungan Literary History, an overview of the Sino-Muslim literary tradition in Central Asia. Dr. Yin teaches modern languages and linguistics in the Department of Education and Language Acquisition at LaGuardia. His main scholarly interest is the literature and folklore of the Dungans, the Sino-Muslims of Central Asia. His other interests include the oral and written literature of the Udaj, an indigenous small-numbered people of Tungusic origin inhabiting the Russian Far East. His scholarly work has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Research Foundation of the City University of New York, among others. His publications include Dungan Folktales and Legends, Peter Lang, 2021, and Mystical Forest, collected poems and short stories of Dungan ethnographer Ali Dazan. Peter Lang, forthcoming. Thank you so much, Dr. Yin.
Thank you so much, Maureen, for the introduction. So I'm going to share my screen now. And there we go. Yeah. So as Maureen said, I will be talking about my work in Dungan literary history today, and I'll be giving a brief overview of the Sino-Muslim literary tradition in Central Asia. So I wanted to start by introducing who the Dungans are. So the Dungans are descendants of the Hui people, who are Sinophone or Chinese-speaking Muslims of China, and they came to Central Asia in three major waves. The first from Northwest China. The first occurred in the winter of 1877-1878 in the immediate aftermath of the failed Dungan Revolt, which lasted from 1862 to 1877 under the Manchu-led Qing dynasty. The second wave of migration happened during the years 1881 to 1884, following the signing of the Treaty of St. Petersburg in 1881, which restored to China the upper Ili Basin in Xinjiang, which had been occupied by Russian troops since 1871 during the Dungan Revolt. And then the most recent and third wave of migration occurred in the first part of the 20th century until the border between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China was closed in the early 1960s. And this was following the Great Chinese Famine of 1959 to 1961. So the Dungans live primarily in what is today Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Eastern Uzbekistan. And according to census data available as of 2020, there are currently an estimated 150,000 Dungans. So this map here shows the distribution of the Dungans in Central Asia. And you could see the areas of greatest concentration in the green hatched area. So again, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. So a few facts about the Dungan language before I talk about the Dungan literary history. So two different Latin alphabets were used for Dungan from 1928 to 1953, after which time the Dungan Cyrillic was adopted and is still in use to this day. Dungan is notably the only Sinitic or Chinese language that is officially written using an alphabet instead of Chinese characters or sinographs. And the Dungan language is listed by the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, better known as UNESCO, as a definitely endangered language. So in terms of the history of Dungan literature, it basically can be divided into three major periods. And I'm going to talk about a few features of each of these and some of the writers that are better known in each of these periods. So the first period is the pre-revolutionary period in Russia, roughly 1877 to 1917. The second major period is the Soviet period, 1917 to 1991. And the third is the post-Soviet period from 1991 to the present. Okay. So in terms of the pre-revolutionary Dungan literature, there was no standard written form. So the Dungans developed a rich oral tradition prior to the October Revolution. And this oral tradition includes songs, tales, sagas, proverbs, riddles, and sayings of the Dungans. And in terms of the tales, Boris Riftin, a Soviet and Russian folklorist who lived from 1932 to 2012, did much to elucidate the peculiarities of Dungan folklore in the foundational Russian language work, Dunganskiy Narodny Сказки, Predania, Dungan Folktales and Legends, first edition, which was published in 1977 and co-authored with the ethnic Dungan scholars Mahmud Hassanov and Ilyas Yusupov. There is now an English language version of this classic work called Dungan Folktales and Legends, which is my own publication, which came out with Peter Lang in 2021. And the LaGuardia Library has actually just obtained a copy of the title if you're interested in seeing it. Dungan Proverbs, there is a large collection that was first published in 2003 and most recently reissued in 2014 by the Institute for Bible Translation in Moscow under the title Su Manai Di Cun Min Hua, or Solomon's Proverbs. So with parallel translations in Chinese characters and Pinyin, and also in Russian, Pinyin, the official romanization system for Chinese. The book has the Chinese title, Zhen Yan, and the Russian title, Mudrye Izrechenie Suleimana. Okay. Next, a little bit about Dungan musical folklore. So in conjunction with the Dungan and Chinese Studies Center at the National Academy of Sciences of the Kyrgyz Republic, the Dungan composer Bakir Bayahunov, who was born in 1933, compiled Zbornik Dunganskих Narodnych Piesin in Instrumentalnych Napievov, a compendium of Dungan folk songs and instrumental tunes, and this was just published last year. Okay, and now I'd like to turn our attention to Soviet Dungan literature. And this could be divided into three major phases. The first is the emergence of Soviet Dungan literature immediately following the October Revolution of 1917. So as with all Soviet writers of ethnic minority groups that were newly acquiring a writing system for their minor language, Dungan writers were required to create a national literature that complied with the demands of socialist realism, the official state-sponsored aesthetic ideology of the Soviet Union, and therefore the creation of the new Soviet man. So the creation of a phonetic writing system for the Dungan language paved the way for the establishment of Dungan ethnic schools and a Dungan language press, and subsequently for the emergence of Soviet Dungan written literature. This stage features the works of several Dungan authors who did not become professional writers, but nonetheless made a distinct contribution to the development of Soviet Dungan literature. And these names include Karim Mayev, Yusuf Yanshansin, Yusuf Tsunvaza, Ismail Magwe, and Abdullah Matsunov. These authors were primarily poets who published their works in the newly established Dungan language newspaper Dun Hushir, or Spark of the East. Next, I'd like to talk about the second phase in Soviet Dungan literature, the works of the pioneers of Soviet Dungan literature. So here we have some well-known names. The first and probably best known name is Yasser Shivaza, who lived until 1988. He was national poet of Kyrgyzstan and the most celebrated poet of the Dungans. The first book that he wrote, Yon Mimsin, or Morning Star, was published in 1931 and is the first printed book in the history of the Dungan people, and it appeared in the Dungan Latin alphabet. He's the author of more than 30 books in all, including collections of poems and short stories in Russian, Kyrgyz, and Dungan. So there is actually an English monograph that speaks about Yasser Shavaza's life and works. And it was Yasser Shavaza's Life and Works of a Soviet Dungan Poet. And this was authored by Svetlana Rimsky-Korsakov-Dyer in 1991 and came out with Peter Lang in Frankfurt. Hussein Makayev, who lived from 1907 to 1970, also known by his Dungan name, Husma Ke, was one of the earliest poets of the Dungans. And he is also known as the author of children's tales. Next, Arli Arbudu, who lived from 1917 to 1986, is considered the most celebrated prose writer of the Dungans. Although he did not begin his writing career until the late 1950s, his short stories, novellas, and articles were continuously published on the pages of the Dungan language newspaper, 10月第七, or October Banner, from 1957 to 1986. The Dungan newspaper changed its name several times. So one of my works in progress is an annotated English translation of Fatima Makayeva's nonfiction novel, Radnia Krovi, or Blood Relations, which tells about the lifetimes and work of Arbudu. So supported by a PSC CUNY Research Award for 2022-2023, this book project will make the story of the best known and beloved Dungan prose writer available to English readers for the first time. Next, I'd like to speak briefly about Mahmud Hasanov, who lived from 1932 to 1977. He was a prose writer whose works had a notable impact on the development of Dungan prose in the 1960s and the 1970s. So his numerous writings include such diverse genres as tales, legends, songs, and anecdotes. In addition, as a leading expert in Dungan folklore, Hasanov was a compiler and translator of the classic 1977 monograph that I mentioned earlier, which I made an English volume of called Dungan Folktales and Legends. Now I'd like to turn our attention to the final phase of the Soviet Dungan literary period, so the works of later Soviet writers. So here, the creation of Dungan ethnic schools and adoption of the Cyrillic alphabet in 1953 for the Dungan writing system mark this last phase. And some of the well-known names here include Muhamia Imazov, who was born in 1941 and is an influential prose writer of the Dungans who began writing during the later Soviet period. Some of his stories have been read over the radio in Dungan and Kyrgyz, so his name is well known among the Dungan people. Another name, Ishar Shisir, born in 1954, is a well-known poet of the Dungans who began his writing career during the same period. In addition to poetry, many scholarly papers of his concerning the development of Dungan literature have been published in Russian, Dungan, Kyrgyz, and Chinese. And then I'd like to mention two Dungan female poets. So Hecher Liva Hadjieva, born 1953, is notably the first female poets of the Dungans ever to be published. Amina Savaza, born in 1959, was another budding Dungan female poet at the time, and she is still active, and her photo is shown below on the slide here. Finally, I'd like to speak about the last major period in Dungan literary history, which is post-Soviet Dungan literature. Although the censorship was lifted at the end of the 20th century, the political and economic chaos of the 1990s led to a crisis in the book market and the stalling of literary production generally in the post-Soviet republics, including in Central Asia. A new generation of Dungan authors who have grown up after the collapse of the Soviet Union, so-called new realists, write about everyday life, but eschew the mystical and surrealist elements of their Soviet era predecessors. The post-Soviet period has been marked by a growing number of Russophone Dungan works, as you will see. So the first name I'd like to mention here is Fatima Musaeva Mashanlor. She is a Dungan female poet who writes both in Dungan and in Russian. Her book, Labyrinty Sudzbui, Novy Zbornik Stikotvoreний, Labyrinths of Fate, a new collection of poems, was published in Taraz, Kazakhstan in 2006. Next, I'd like to mention Dao Suahunov, who lived from 1942 to 2018. He published Отдаленные судьбы, исторический роман, Distant Destinies, a historical novel, in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan in 2015. So written in Russian, the book is based on the true story of Yusupov, as told by his grandson, Ilyas Yusupov, the well-known Dungan scholar and doctor of historical sciences, who was also one of the co-compilers and co-translators of the classic Dungan Folktales and Legends volume that I mentioned, that was published in '77 in the first edition. The book tells of the fate of Yusup as a boy who was separated from his kin in China in the aftermath of the failed Dungan revolt in search of a better life in Central Asia. Next, I'd like to mention Fatima Makeyeva, who was born in 1935, a philologist and non-fictional prose writer. Makeyeva published, notably, a non-fiction novel about Soviet Dungan prose writer Arbudu with critical commentary, as I mentioned earlier. Blood Relations, a nonfiction novel, and this came out in 2016 in Kyrgyzstan. So a daughter of Soviet Dungan poet Huseyin Makeyev, Makeyeva holds the distinction of being the first female Dungan candidate of philological sciences. So a leading Dungan philologist specializing in Dungan literature and culture, Makeyeva also wrote an authoritative volume on Soviet Dungan literary history titled Становление и развитие Dunganской советской литературы, the emergence and development of Soviet Dungan literature, which was published in 1984. So with support from a 2021 Mellon ACLS Fellowship and a PSC CUNY Research Award for 2021-2022, I am currently at work on an English language volume based on Makeyeva's 1984 monograph. And then I would like to mention also Ali John, born in 1951, who is a well-known Dungan poet ethnographer. He published two collections of original Russian language poetry, one in 2011 titled Tiny Les, or Mystical Forest, and the other in 2021 titled Maya Osien, or My Autumn. And he has also written several short stories in Russian. So a project of mine, which is currently under contract, Mystical Forest, Collected Poems and Short Stories of Dungan ethnographer Ali John, is a unique compendium presenting 103 poems and 4 short stories of John in an annotated English translation of mine. So these collected literary works were written over a span of more than half a century, from 1969 to 2021, in the tradition of the poet ethnographer, while acquainting the reader with the complex world of his inner thoughts and feelings. John also provides valuable insights into the realities and aspirations of his people, the Dungans of Central Asia. Right. And lastly, I just would like to mention one writer of the youngest generation, Ramzadin Musayev, who was born in 1998. A collection of his poems called 18 minut разочарования, сборник стихотворений, which I'm translating as 18 Minutes of Blight, a collection of poems, was published by Ridero in 2018. He was born in Taraz, Kazakhstan, and was nominated for the National Literary Prize Poet of the Year 2016. Right. And finally, this is just a list of the references that I used in today's presentation: Aristov, Dyer, McCabe, Mosley, and myself. And if you have any questions after the colloquium today, please feel free to email me at kyin@legcc.cuny.edu or visit my website at kjy.georgetown.domains. Thank you so very much.
Thank you. That was fascinating. Does anyone have any questions? Well, I have a question, maybe, and so people can think about any questions they might have. So I was wondering, what was it that first got you interested in literature and folklore of the Dungans? Was it something you read or you heard on the radio and it just kind of sparked something?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's actually, it was actually something I became interested in when I was a graduate student. And it was because of my own personal as well as academic background dealing with China studies, as well as with studies of Russia and Eurasia, Russia and the former Soviet Union. So I learned about this, this small group of people who happened to be a diasporic Chinese-speaking group that were actually living in the former Soviet Union, and therefore Russian-speaking and heavily, of course, influenced by Russians, as well as by the neighboring Turkic and other Central Asian neighbors. And that got me, and one of the first works that I was able to get my hands on here in the United States through Interlibrary loan was actually the Dungan Folktales and Legends volume that I mentioned, in which came out in 1977. And from there I started reading it and was just so excited by it that I sort of began my translation career in that sense as well, together with my scholarly research.
That's great. Thank you. I was going to ask you, could you put the website in the chat?
Oh, absolutely.
When it was on the screen, I tried to.
Sure, absolutely. No problem.
Okay. And for all of you, if you have further questions and you are open to having people ask, feel free to put your emails in the chat. Christy, you have your hand up.
Yeah, the quick question I had is, I'm wondering, and can you hear me?
Sure.
Okay, great, thanks. I'm wondering what the political status of the Dungan people is currently in their various nations where they live. Are they fairly secure, able to practice what they wish, or are they very limited?
Yeah, that's a great question, Christy. Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm in constant contact with researchers and others, and I'm working on my projects. And there is an active Dungan and Chinese Studies Center at the, as I mentioned, at the Kyrgyz State University in Bishkek. And so that is really a center sort of for the cultural preservation and promotion. And I'm in contact with several of those faculty members there, and they are doing quite a bit now to promote Dungan language, Dungan culture. And I know also in several of the public schools, there is also teaching of Dungan language as celebration of anniversaries, for example, of well-known Dungan people, such as writers or other historical figures. And I see this on the social media. Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
are there any other questions? I just put a feedback form in the chat, and if you could all fill that out, it's so helpful to us in planning our future colloquiums. And I realize I might have missed some people because they signed off, so I'll be emailing. Oh, thank you. Put the website in there.
Oh, you're welcome.
But if, does anyone have any more questions?
Really fast question. When you're translating, what language are you translating from?
Oh,
Chinese?
predominantly from Russian, although because I'm a Chinese speaker as well, I am able to look at the source texts that are available as in Dungan if they're extant, and I have access to them. Although of course I've never studied Dungan per se, so it's a research language. So, it helps me with the translations sometimes when I have the Russian, if the Russian is a translation of the Dungan. But as you might have heard from my presentation, many of the works now coming out by the Dungan writers are actually in Russian. So they are Russophone writers. But it definitely helps to know the Dungan, be able to read some of the Dungan in addition to knowing the Russian with the translation work.
Well, I don't know if there's any more questions, but this has been so lively and fascinating.